The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, and Marion Castellan read the codicil to my grandmother's will twice before I fully understood what it was asking of me. I hadn't seen my grandmother, Eleanor Voss, in 11 years. We weren't estranged in any dramatic sense. No fight, no scene, just a slow drift that neither of us bothered to reverse. The kind of distance families let happen because closing it always feels like it can wait until next year. Then she died, alone, in the house she'd lived in for 53 years, and I inherited that house along with a clause no ordinary will should contain. Before the property could legally transfer into my name, I was required to spend 30 consecutive nights sleeping inside it. Not visiting. Sleeping. And more specifically, I was required to sleep in a different room each night, following an order laid out in a sealed document my grandmother had filed with her attorney years before her death, to be opened only by the inheriting party, room by room, night by night, with no exceptions and no explanation offered in advance. Marion told me this wasn't actually as unusual as I might think. Some older wills use residency requirements to prevent immediate resale, to force an heir to actually reckon with a property before disposing of it. I nodded like that satisfied me. It didn't. My grandmother had never been sentimental about that house in any of the rare conversations we'd had about it. If anything, she'd always spoken about it like an obligation rather than a home. I didn't understand why she'd want me tethered to it for 30 nights unless the point wasn't sentiment at all. I moved in on a Tuesday in October and opened the sealed envelope in my car before I'd even carried in my first bag. Night one was the primary bedroom, her bedroom, the one she'd died in, though the letter didn't mention that detail. I only knew it because the funeral home had said as much when I signed for her belongings. The room was unremarkable in every way I could name. Floral wallpaper faded to the color of weak tea, a bed stripped down to its mattress, a window facing the back garden, badly overgrown now, weeds swallowing what must have once been a rose bed. I slept fine. I want to be honest about that, because I think the ordinariness of that first night is part of what made everything after it land as hard as it did. Nothing happened. I woke up at 7, made coffee in a kitchen that still had her handwriting on masking tape labeling which cabinet held what, and told myself this 30-night requirement was exactly what Marion had suggested. A formality, mildly strange, ultimately harmless. Night 2 was a guest room down the hall, and night 3 was another guest room beside it, and by night 5 I'd stopped expecting anything at all. The nights blurred into a routine of unfamiliar mattresses and unfamiliar ceilings, each room a little more anonymous than the last, guest spaces that had clearly gone unused for years, smelling faintly of cedar and dust. Night 8 was the nursery. I hadn't known the house had a nursery. My grandmother raised 2 children in that house, my mother and my uncle Desmond, both decades ago, both grown and gone long before I was born. And I suppose I'd never thought to ask where their infant years had actually happened. The room was small, tucked at the end of the upstairs hall behind a door I'd assumed was a closet. A crib still stood in the corner, dust-sheeted, and a mobile of faded paper birds hung motionless above it. I slept on a cot Marion's office had arranged to have delivered to the house, one for each unfurnished room on my list. I want to say I slept poorly out of simple discomfort, an unfamiliar cot in an unfamiliar room. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, I woke to the specific, unmistakable sound of the mobile turning. Not swinging from a draft, turning slowly with the faint mechanical clicking these things make when they're actually wound and running. I lay very still and listened to it complete 2 full rotations before it wound down to silence again. I checked it the next morning. The winding key was missing entirely, had clearly been missing for years, based on the rust in the empty slot where it should have sat. I told myself that morning, standing in the kitchen with my coffee going cold, that old houses settle, that pipes and foundations make sounds that get misattributed to all sorts of things in the dark, and that a rusted mechanism doesn't necessarily mean a mechanism that couldn't somehow still function. I believed about 60% of my own explanation. I believed it enough to continue. Night 12 was Desmond's childhood bedroom, according to a faded name plaque still screwed to the door. I hadn't met my Uncle Desmond. My mother mentioned him rarely and always briefly, always with a specific carefulness in her tone that I'd noticed as a child without understanding it. I asked her once, years ago, what had happened to him. She told me he'd died young, an accident, and changed the subject with enough finality that I never asked again. His room had been left almost entirely intact, a bedspread still patterned with a decades-old design of rockets and stars, a small bookshelf of paperbacks with cracked spines, a corkboard still pinned with ticket stubs and photographs so faded I couldn't make out most of the faces. I found myself studying those photographs longer than I meant to, trying to find a version of my mother young enough to recognize. And I did, eventually, in the corner of one image, a girl of maybe 10, standing beside a boy a few years older, both of them squinting against sunlight in what looked like this same backyard, back when the rosebed was still a rosebed. I slept in that room and dreamed, vividly, of standing in that same backyard at night, and of a boy's voice calling out from somewhere near the tree line, not in fear, just calling, the way you'd call someone in for dinner. I woke up before I could make out what he was actually saying, my heart going harder than a dream about nothing should have earned. I looked up my uncle's obituary that morning on my phone, sitting on the edge of that rocket-patterned bedspread. He died at age 11. The obituary was brief, decades old, scanned into some regional archive, and it listed only a date and a phrase I read 3 separate times before I fully absorbed it. Died at home, following a brief illness. I don't know why that phrasing unsettled me the way it did. I think it was the word brief. Whatever took an 11-year-old boy did it fast enough that whoever wrote his obituary felt the need to specify. Night 18 was the downstairs bathroom, an odd inclusion on the list at first glance. Small and purely functional, nothing about it suggesting history the way the nursery or Desmond's room had. I nearly laughed reading it on the sealed order, relieved for one night to have drawn something so mundane. The cot didn't fit in that room, so Marion's instructions had specified a sleeping bag on the tile instead, which struck me as almost comic until I actually tried to fall asleep on a hard bathroom floor and found myself instead simply lying there, awake, staring at a ceiling I could barely make out in the dark. Sometime after 2, I heard water running in the sink beside me, not dripping, running, a full steady stream, the kind you'd hear if someone had turned the tap on deliberately. I sat up. The tap was off, visibly off, the handle in its resting position, and yet the sound continued for a full 10 seconds after I was staring directly at it before it cut off as abruptly as it had started. I checked the mirror before I let myself leave that room in the morning and found, low on the glass, near where a small child's height would place their hand, a faint handprint in the residual condensation, in a bathroom that had not, as far as I could tell, held any actual steam or moisture the night before to produce condensation in the first place. I didn't call my mother again that day. I think I'd started, somewhere around then, to understand that I wasn't going to get any more clarity from her than she'd already given me, and that whatever answers were left to find, I was going to have to find them inside that house instead. Night 15 was the attic. I want to describe the attic honestly, because I think what happened there is the point at which I stopped being able to explain any of this away with old house logic. The attic had been finished at some point, decades ago, based on the paneling, then apparently abandoned as living space and used for storage instead. Boxes stacked along every wall, furniture under sheets, the particular stillness of a room that had been sealed off from the rest of a house's daily life for a very long time. There was no bed frame, no cot delivered for this one. Marion's list had specified, for this single night only, that I was to sleep on the attic floor itself, no furniture, a detail so oddly specific that I'd assumed it was a clerical mistake until I actually stood in that empty space and understood, somehow, that it wasn't. I laid out a sleeping bag in the center of the room, surrounded by decades of my family's discarded belongings, and I did not sleep well, not because of any sound this time, but because of a feeling that settled over me almost immediately and refused to lift. The specific, wordless certainty that I was not alone in that room, despite every visible indication that I was. Around midnight, one of the dust sheets across the room shifted. Not dramatically, a slow settling, the kind of movement a sheet makes when something beneath it resettles its weight. I told myself it was structural, old fabric responding to temperature change, the house breathing the way old houses do. I did not go check. I want to be honest that I did not go check, and that the reason I didn't wasn't caution. It was a much simpler, much older fear than caution. The kind that doesn't reason with you. The kind that just tells you, plainly, not tonight, and you listen. In the morning, I looked. Beneath that sheet was an old wooden playpen, child-sized, the slats along one side visibly, deliberately broken outward, splintered in a pattern that looked less like decay and more like something had needed, at some point, to get out of it in a hurry. I called my mother that afternoon for the first time since I'd moved into the house. I asked her, directly this time, what had actually happened to Desmond. She was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she told me something in a voice I'd never heard her use before, flat and careful in a way that told me she'd rehearsed saying it, at some point, for exactly this eventual question. She said the official story was a fever, an illness that moved too fast for the doctors of that era to catch. She said our grandmother had never fully believed that story herself, though she'd never said so to anyone outside the family, and that the two of them, mother and daughter, had not spoken about that house or what happened in it more than a handful of times in the following 40 years. I asked her what our grandmother actually believed happened. My mother said one sentence and then asked, gently but firmly, not to talk about it further, not yet, not until I was through whatever it was I was doing in that house. She said she believed something in that house had been there long before any of us moved in, and that it had taken a liking to the youngest child in every generation that lived there since. I am the youngest child of my generation. I didn't sleep that night at all. I sat in the kitchen with every light on, which the will's instructions hadn't technically forbidden, and told myself I would call Marion in the morning and simply refuse to continue. I did not refuse to continue. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me, sitting in that kitchen at 4 in the morning, surrounded by my grandmother's handwriting on decades-old masking tape, understood that whatever this ritual actually was, whatever my grandmother had actually built into that sealed room-by-room order, it was not cruelty, and it was not carelessness. She had lived in that house for 53 years. Whatever she was afraid of, she had lived alongside it for over half a century, and had somehow kept every subsequent child in this family safe from it in the process, including, eventually, me. I decided at 4 in the morning, exhausted and afraid, that the sequence itself might matter more than I'd been assuming, that the order of these 30 rooms wasn't arbitrary, that it might, in fact, be the entire point. Night 20 was a small room at the back of the house I hadn't previously noticed, accessible only through what I'd assumed was a linen closet. It held nothing but a single chair facing a wall, and a framed photograph of my grandmother as a young woman, standing in front of this house on what must have been the day she and my grandfather first moved in, decades before either of my grandmother's children were born. I sat in that chair for a long while before attempting to sleep, studying that photograph, and I noticed something I hadn't on my first pass. Behind my grandmother, in an upstairs window, was a shape. Not clearly a person, not clearly anything, just an irregularity in the glass, a smudge that could have been a reflection, a flaw in the film, anything at all, except that the window it appeared in, I realized with a specific cold certainty, was the nursery window, in a photograph taken years before that room had ever held a crib. I slept in that chair rather than on the floor, and I dreamed of my grandmother, young, standing in that same spot, looking up at that same window and saying something to it quietly that I couldn't make out no matter how hard the dream logic of my own mind strained to hear it. I woke with the specific, irrational conviction that whatever she'd said to that window all those decades ago had been some kind of agreement, a term, a negotiation whose exact conditions I was now, 30 nights at a time, fulfilling on her behalf. Night 22 sent me to the cellar, and by then I'd stopped being surprised that a house I'd assumed I understood the layout of kept producing rooms I hadn't known existed. The cellar door was in the kitchen, behind a set of shelves I'd assumed were simply built into the wall, and it took me nearly 20 minutes with the sealed order in hand to even locate the mechanism that let it swing open. The space below was unfinished, cold in a way the rest of the house wasn't. Concrete floor and exposed joists overhead, and along one wall, a row of shelving held decades of preserved jars, my grandmother's handwriting on every label, most of it ordinary, tomatoes and peaches and things I recognized from her kitchen. On the bottom shelf, tucked behind the last jar, I found a small tin box that did not belong with the rest, and inside it, folded many times over, a handwritten journal in a hand I recognized from the masking tape upstairs. I read as much of it as I could before exhaustion caught up with me, sitting on the cold cellar floor with a flashlight. The one night the sealed order had made no mention of light at all, positively or negatively, and I've wondered since whether that omission was itself deliberate. The journal wasn't a full record. It was fragments, entries decades apart, written by a woman working out, slowly and privately, across most of her adult life, what she actually believed lived in that house alongside her family. She wrote about a presence she'd first noticed as a young bride, new to the house, that seemed to attach itself specifically to whichever child in the household was youngest at any given time. She wrote about losing Desmond, in language far more direct than the obituary had allowed itself to be, and about the specific, private theory she'd developed afterward, that the presence hadn't taken him out of malice, but out of a kind of desperate, uncomprehending loneliness that didn't understand the difference between wanting a child's company and ending a child's life trying to keep it. She wrote about the ritual she eventually developed through years of what she called, in the journal's own words, careful negotiation, a sequence of nights and rooms she'd worked out through trial and consequence that seemed to satisfy whatever this thing needed without costing her family anything further. She never explained, in anything I read, how she'd actually worked out that sequence, what the trials had cost her to learn, and I found myself, reading that unfinished thought, deeply grateful she hadn't felt the need to elaborate. The remaining rooms passed with a texture I can only describe as watchful. Nothing overtly happened most nights. But I began to understand, somewhere around night 24, that the absence of incident had become its own kind of evidence, because I could feel, distinctly, that I was being observed in a way that had nothing to do with paranoia and everything to do with an attention I had simply finally learned to recognize. The house had a rhythm to it that I hadn't noticed on night 1, when everything was unfamiliar enough that ordinary strangeness read as simply new. By night 24, I understood, the way you understand the specific creak of your own front door, exactly which sounds belonged to this house and which sounds did not, and increasingly, some nights I heard the second kind. Night 29 was the nursery again. The sealed order looped back, deliberately, on the second to last night to the room where this had first become undeniable. I recognized this, going in, as either a mercy or a test, and I still don't know which it actually was. The mobile turned again that night, exactly as it had on night 8, 2 full slow rotations before falling still. But this time, in the silence after, I heard something I hadn't the first time, a small voice, very close to the crib, humming a few bars of a melody I didn't recognize, in a register too young, too small, to belong to anyone but a child. I did not move. I did not speak. I lay on that cot with my eyes open in the dark and listened until the humming trailed off into nothing, And somewhere in that silence, I understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with instinct, that whatever this was, it was not malicious in the way I'd spent 29 nights assuming. It was lonely. It had been lonely, in that specific unbearable way of something very old and very isolated, for longer than any of us had been alive. Night 30 was her bedroom again, the room where I'd started, the room where she died. I understood, walking in that final night, that the sequence had been a circle the entire time, out and back, and that whatever I was meant to complete by returning to where I began, I was about to find out. I didn't sleep much that last night, not from fear exactly, but from a kind of alert stillness I'd been building toward for 29 nights without fully realizing it. Sometime past midnight, I felt the specific temperature shift in a room that precedes, I now understand, a presence making itself known rather than simply observing. I sat up. The room was empty, visibly, entirely empty, and yet the air held a density it hadn't a moment before. I said out loud, into that emptiness, the only thing I could think to say, "Thank you for keeping them safe." I didn't know, saying it, whether I meant my mother or my uncle who never got the chance to grow up, or every child in this family across 53 years I'd never even think to count. I think I meant all of them at once. The temperature shifted back. The density left the room as plainly as it had arrived. And somewhere in that departure, faint and distant, like something exhaling for the first time in a very long time, I heard, one last time, that same few bars of hummed melody, fading toward the nursery down the hall, and then fading past even that, into whatever quiet this house had been waiting 53 years to finally have. I signed the final paperwork 3 days later. The house is mine now, in every legal sense that matters. I have not moved out. I sleep in the primary bedroom most nights, though every so often, without any requirement compelling me to, I find myself carrying a blanket down the hall to the nursery instead, and I don't examine that choice too closely. I still hear the mobile turn sometimes on quiet nights. I've stopped being afraid of it. I've started instead to leave the winding key I finally found, tucked in the back of a drawer downstairs, sitting on the little shelf beside the crib, in case whatever's still here ever decides it wants to use it itself. I think about what my grandmother agreed to, all those decades ago, standing in front of this house on the day she moved in. I think about 53 years of quietly keeping a bargain with something patient enough to wait an entire human lifetime for it to be honored again. I don't know what happens when I'm the one who eventually can't keep it anymore. I've already started writing my own version of that sealed envelope, just in case.